Hollywood made him a hero. Schindler's List swept the box office, dominated the Academy Awards, and cemented his name in history. But the real Oskar Schindler? He was no saint. He was a hustler, a smooth-talking con man chasing the next high. Only one thing motivated him: money. He even joined the Nazi Party in a hopeless attempt to get rich quick. And yet this same man became one of the Holocaust's greatest heroes. The charm and trickery that had once served his greed became his sharpest weapons against the Nazis. He bribed SS officers, spent his fortune smuggling food and medicine, and gambled with his life again and again to rescue over 1,200 Jews from the gas chambers. His own wife despised him, but the Jews he saved hailed him as their hero. They stood by him long after the war when he was penniless. So who was the crooked Nazi who became one of history's most unlikely heroes? Oskar Schindler had always been a troublemaker. As a teenager, he earned the nickname Schindler the Crook for petty crimes like forging his report card and stealing from customers at his job. He married Emily Pelzel at 19, blowing her dowry on a flashy car and shacking up with multiple mistresses. The police knew him well. Public drunkenness had landed him behind bars more than once. But underneath the bravado, Schindler had one true obsession: cold, hard cash. The only problem? He was terrible at keeping it. He bankrupted his family's business, failed as a salesman, and stumbled from one dead-end job to the next. Schindler was born into a wealthy family in the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia, and he grew up deeply loyal to his German roots. So when the Sudeten German Party started gaining popularity, he saw a golden opportunity. The party was pro-Nazi and fueled by anti-Semitic propaganda, but to Schindler, it was a path to make profitable connections. And those connections paid off. In 1936, they helped him land a gig with Nazi Germany's military intelligence service, selling secrets about Czech railways and troop movements. It was a good hustle, a solid way to make some side money. And if it helped the Nazis annex the Sudetenland, that was just a perk. He considered himself German anyway. The gig lasted until the Czech authorities swooped in and arrested Schindler for espionage. And that should have been the end of the story. But history bailed Schindler out. Just a few months after his arrest, the Nazis annexed the Sudetenland. Schindler was now a free man. Immediately, he applied for membership in the Nazi Party. Despite his arrests and shady record, he was accepted. So when World War II broke out, Schindler arrived in Nazi-occupied Krakow, joining the flood of German businessmen eager to turn chaos into cash. By day, he traded illegal goods on the black market. By night, he downed shots with local SS officers, charming his way through Nazi social circles. It didn't take long for him to earn a reputation as a smooth-talking opportunist who always had a beautiful woman on his arm. At that time, the Nazis were stripping Poles of their property, seizing businesses left and right. Schindler saw his chance. Taking advantage of his connections, he convinced the Nazis to let him take over an enamelware factory right outside the city, stolen from its Jewish owners. Schindler hoped this would be his big break, but he had no idea how to run a successful factory, so he leaned on someone who did: Abraham Bankier, the Jewish manager who had run the plant before the Nazis had commandeered it. With Bankier overseeing daily operations, Schindler was able to keep the factory afloat. By 1941, business was booming. Schindler was finally building the kind of wealth he had always dreamed of. But outside the factory walls, Krakow was changing fast. The Nazis had begun their campaign to destroy all Jewish life in Europe. But the harsh laws and Star of David armbands were just the start. Humiliation became part of daily life as SS officers dragged elderly men into the streets, shaved their beards, and forced them to scrub the sidewalks. But things could always get worse. That March, the Nazis forced the city's 15,000 Jews into a ghetto, an open-air prison of barbed wire and stone walls. And with the ghetto came a new Nazi policy. Factory owners could pay a daily fee to rent out Jewish forced laborers for a fraction of what they'd paid Polish workers. To Schindler, the deal was too good to pass up. He quickly signed on. Soon, Jewish slaves from the Krakow ghetto were streaming into Amalia. Other factory owners beat their Jewish laborers, working them until they passed out from exhaustion. But Schindler always made sure his workers had enough to eat. He went out of his way to secure medicine for the sick. He still prioritized profit, but as he spent more time with his Jewish workers, something within him began to shift, and kept shifting. Because in July of 1942, Nazis stormed the Krakow ghetto, beating anyone in their path and forcing Jews onto trains bound for Brünnlitz extermination camp. 14 of Schindler's workers, including his trusted manager, were shoved into cattle cars, headed to hell. Schindler couldn't just watch as men he knew were dragged into the inferno. Somehow, he convinced the Nazis that he needed those workers to keep his factory running. It worked. The men were plucked from the train. For a moment, Schindler breathed easy, knowing he had just saved 14 lives. But that relief didn't last. He had saved 14 people, but how many thousands were being packed into cattle cars and driven towards their own doom? Later he reflected, "Beyond this day, no thinking person could fail to see what would happen. I was now resolved to do everything in my power to defeat the system." Schindler's transformation was complete. The money-hungry hustler and Nazi opportunist was now willing to risk everything to save lives. He knew he was endangering his wealth, his reputation, even his own life. He didn't care. 370 Jews worked in his factory. He couldn't save everyone, but he would do everything to save those he could, even if it meant squaring off against the Nazis. He got his chance to defy the Nazis sooner than he expected. In March 1943, the Nazis announced that the Krakow ghetto would be liquidated, with its residents either deported to the Plaszów forced labor camp or shot on the spot. Desperate to protect his Jewish workers, Schindler kept them at the factory overnight as the Nazis stormed the ghetto. They survived the initial liquidation, but soon after they too were deported to Plaszów. If life in the Krakow ghetto had been a nightmare, Plaszów was a living hell. Prisoners rarely survived more than a couple of weeks under the terrorizing command of Amman Gut. Known as the Butcher of Plaszów, Gut would shoot prisoners from the balcony of his villa for sport, or line them up randomly for abuse. Then he'd return to his classical music as if nothing had happened. Schindler knew he had to be smart if he had any chance of saving his Jewish workers. So he slipped into the familiar role of the charming opportunist. He befriended Gut, spending long nights drinking into oblivion at his villa and bribing him with black market caviar and cigarettes. And then he made his plea. He knew he wouldn't get anywhere begging Gut to spare his workers' lives. Instead, he complained that his workers weren't productive enough. The 10-kilometer commute from the camp to the factory and back was sapping their strength, and he wasn't getting enough out of them. Things would be a lot easier if his workers were allowed to live on the factory grounds instead. Gut wasn't the sort of person to do anything out of the kindness of his heart. It took a hefty bribe to convince him. But finally, he agreed to build a smaller camp near the Amalia factory for all the Jews who worked nearby. The Amalia subcamp was no picnic, but to the survivors of Plaszów, it was a sanctuary. There were no arbitrary beatings, no one passing out from exhaustion, no dogs threatening to tear prisoners apart. When food and medicine became scarce, Schindler spent his own money to buy it for his workers off the black market. Schindler was crafty, and he deployed all his old tricks. This time, though, he wasn't thinking of his bottom line. He was desperately saving lives. As the war dragged on, Schindler knew he needed a good reason to keep the factory open. Amalia began churning out mess kits and ammunition shells, becoming essential to the war effort. The Nazis had no idea that Schindler's workers were making defective bullets, or that Schindler's labor rosters were forged, adjusting skills and ages to make even the elderly and sick appear indispensable. But his work didn't stop at the factory walls. Secretly, Schindler began working with Jewish relief networks, smuggling money, letters, and vital information to prisoners with the help of the Poles surrounding the factory. He even traveled to Budapest to alert the Hungarian Relief and Rescue Committee about what was going on in Poland. The risk was massive. If the Gestapo caught on, Schindler could have been shot immediately. He lived in constant fear, always on high alert. The Gestapo made several surprise visits to his factory to interrogate him, but each time, he skillfully distracted them with vodka and other black market gifts. By the summer of 1944, Schindler's factory had become an unexpected refuge for over 1,450 Jewish prisoners. Schindler was raking in a fortune and spending it just as fast. Almost every cent went back into bribes, food, and medicine for his Jewish workers. And then the Red Army closed in on Krakow. Panicking, the Nazis began evacuating Plaszów and its subcamps and shipping its prisoners out west. And they ordered that all armaments factories relocate to the interior of Germany. Unless he could find a way to bring his workers with them, he would be forced to abandon them to their fate. Schindler watched helplessly as SS officers shoved hundreds of his Jewish workers into cattle cars bound for the Mauthausen concentration camp. With his black market loot, he bribed the SS officers to give the prisoners water along the way, hoping that small act of mercy would help them survive the journey. he learned that the rest of the Jewish prisoners of Plaszów would soon be deported to the Gross Rosen and Auschwitz concentration camps. If he didn't act, they would die. Schindler hurried to secure a new factory site, bribing goods with jewels, vodka, and women to gain authorization to transfer a group of Jewish prisoners to work for him there. In the fall of 1944, Schindler's factory was relocated to Brünnlitz, back in his hometown of the Sudetenland, and he was authorized to bring 1,000 Jewish prisoners with him. Now the question was, who would he save? Each individual on the list would need to appear absolutely essential to the war effort. But as he prepared for the transfer, Schindler was arrested on the charges of bribing Gut. A couple of the Jewish prisoners rushed in to create the documents that would become known as Schindler's List. After hours and hours of agony, they finally compiled two lists, one of 700 men and another of 300 women. The lists included some of Schindler's previous workers, but most had never worked for him before. Some families had bribed their way in. Others simply got lucky. If your name was on the list, you had a fighting chance of survival. Finally, after more than a week in jail, Schindler was released, and the lucky 1,000 were loaded onto trains headed to the new factory. But on the way, the transports got diverted. Instead of arriving safely at Schindler's new factory, the men found themselves at the Gross Rosen camp, and the women facing the smokestacks of Auschwitz. The men were released within a few days, but the women languished in Auschwitz, their chances of survival dwindling by the day. Finally, he worked out a deal with camp personnel. The women would be released, but Schindler would have to pay 7 Reichsmarks every day per worker. Without hesitation, Schindler agreed. It was an extraordinary deal. The only moment in Auschwitz's terrible history, the Jews were allowed to leave alive while the gas chambers were operating. When the women finally arrived at Brünnlitz, starving and weak, a line of male prisoners greeted them, crying and waving. Behind them, a group of SS officers grimaced, Schindler standing calmly among them. Ignoring his Nazi entourage, Schindler reassured the women, "There's hot soup waiting for you. Don't worry, you are with me now." The Brünnlitz factory ran from October 1944 until the end of the war. The Schindlers lived at the camp itself, their very presence shielding the prisoners from the Nazis' brutality. The food became more and more scarce as the war dragged on. Schindler continued to spend his profits at the black market, scrounging whatever he could for his workers. On Jewish holidays, he even managed to scrape together a little extra so his workers could celebrate. His wife Emily, too, risked her life, sneaking in and out of the factory to smuggle in food and medicine, and often giving up her own meals to feed the prisoners. As the Russians marched closer and factories were abandoned, Schindler allowed his workers to steal wool from neighboring sites, which became sweaters and mittens, protection against the harsh winter. Schindler even managed to smuggle the prisoners some guns, so they would be prepared in case the Nazis tried to eliminate them before the Soviets arrived. And the camp kept swelling. In January 1945, the Schindlers rescued over 100 Jewish men from Golejow, a subcamp of Auschwitz. Locked inside 2 cattle cars with no food, water, or protection from the bitter cold, the prisoners endured 7 days until arriving at Brünnlitz. The SS commandant on site was about to send them back until Emily intervened. She stalled until Schindler arrived and convinced the commandant that he needed those men as laborers for the factory. When the Schindlers opened the doors of the cattle cars, 107 frostbitten skeletal faces stared back at them. Quickly, the Schindlers found them medical treatment and food. Schindler even convinced the commandant to allow him to bury the bodies of the 13 men who had died on the journey in accordance with Jewish law. The Nazis had intended to burn them. Life at Brünnlitz was a constant gamble, and Schindler knew that at any moment the camp could be liquidated and the prisoners murdered. He didn't have a relationship with the camp commandant, which meant his usual tricks would be a lot harder to pull off. All the while, the factory continued operating. But it wasn't churning out armaments. Over the course of its history, the plant produced a single wagon load of ammunition. Whenever an SS guard would enter, everyone hurried to appear busy. But as soon as the guard left, they would return to knitting sweaters. For the 1,098 prisoners at Brünnlitz, the nightmare ended on May of 1945. Germany surrendered. Whoever remained of Europe's Jews would begin to rebuild. But Schindler wasn't out of the woods. As a former German spy, he could be arrested as a war criminal if the Soviets caught him. He and Emily had to flee before it was too late. So Schindler called his workers together for one final speech, urging them to hold on to hope, stay humane, and maintain order. He warned them not to seek revenge on the Germans and reminded them about the ordinary people around the factory who had smuggled in food to help them survive. He also thanked the Jewish workers who had worked alongside him to save so many lives. "Do not thank me for your survival," he said. "Thank your own people who worked day and night to save you." The prisoners did not want to leave their savior without a parting gift. Piecing together the scant food they had left, they made him a birthday cake. One prisoner donated a gold tooth, which they shaped into a ring and inscribed with the Talmudic saying, "He who saves one life saves the entire world." That was exactly what he had done. Saved over 1,000 worlds. Schindler often referred to his factory as his Noah's Ark, preserving a cross-section of Jewish society. Amid the Nazi devastation, a fraction of the Jewish people would survive. Finally, the Schindlers made it back into the Allied-controlled part of Germany, broke, exhausted, and desperate. Schindler had spent every last mark trying to save his Jewish workers. Now, he turned to Jewish groups for aid. He applied for reimbursement from the Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, claiming he had spent 2.64 million Reichsmarks, nearly $20 million today, to keep his workers alive. Schindler and Emily were prepared to leave Germany and all of its nightmares behind them and start a new life in Argentina. But Schindler's next few businesses failed. And in 1957, Schindler returned to Germany alone. He spent the rest of his life between Germany and Israel, cared for by the Schindlerjuden, the very people whose lives he had saved. In 1974, his lifetime of drinking finally caught up with him, and his liver failed. He was buried in Israel, where his grave reads, "The unforgettable rescuer of 1,200 persecuted Jews." The story of Schindler's courage began to surface while he was alive, but fame didn't find him until he was already gone. As early as 1949, survivors began to write about him in their testimonies. A journalist even tried to publish his story, but never could. With the wounds of the war so fresh, no one wanted to hear about a good German, especially one with such a crooked past. In 1964, the BBC ran a segment about him, while he was still alive and penniless. Yad Vashem considered adding him to the righteous among the nations, but declined after 2 Jewish men from Krakow accused him of theft and abuse in the early years of the war. Everything changed in 1982 when Australian author Thomas Keneally published his novel, Schindler's List, the product of months of research and detailed interviews with Schindlerjuden, Schindler's wife, and post-war friends. 11 years later, Steven Spielberg's award-winning film by the same name catapulted Schindler's story into stardom. The film brought the Holocaust into global consciousness, forever shaping the world's understanding of this moment in history. One survivor later said, "Oskar Schindler gave me life, but Steven Spielberg gave me a voice." That same year, Yad Vashem added both Oskar and Emily Schindler to the righteous among the nations. So, was Oskar Schindler a hero? He certainly wasn't the typical pure-hearted do-gooder we like to imagine. His motives were questionable, his methods crooked. And yet, it was precisely his willingness to lie, bribe, and manipulate that made him a hero. As Keneally wrote, he negotiated the salvation of his 1,200 Jews by operating right at the heart of the system, using all the tools of the devil: bribery, black marketeering, and lies. One of his survivors said it best, "I don't know what his motives were. I asked him and never got a clear answer, but I don't give a damn. What's important is that he saved our lives. And the 1,200 Jews he saved and their thousands of descendants stand as living proof of his transformation." And maybe that's an important lesson too. Heroes come in all forms, and even the most deeply flawed among us can rise to the occasion when history demands it.